as we take a step back and think about artificial intelligence, there is a lot of investment. There is rapid adoption from all these companies, including ours, which should lead to higher productivity down the road. Not all the spending is going to pay off. There's going to be some winners and some losers. Like back in the tech bubble, there's a handful of companies that survived and thrived, but many of them, Pets.com and others, they're not in existence anymore. And about the labor market, we do think there's going to be some disruption, especially in the near term. Now, let's look at all this spending, which thinking about spending on hardware, equipment, and software. That typically is about 3% of US GDP, so a very small part. But because of all this spending that has been going on by the 4 hyperscalers, as we call them, has made a notable impact and contribution on GDP. I talked about how, and I showed the GDP graph before, how the US economy grew about 1.5% in the first half of the year. Almost 40% of that, or 0.6%, was driven by spending on equipment and software. And you can see that's the biggest contribution since the late 90s in the tech bubble. Now, to put that, though, in perspective, if we look at the cumulative spending, you can see that if we were compared to all the CapEx spending that happened back in the late 90s, you can see how it's potentially there's a lot more room to go versus back then. Now, let's think about productivity for a second. That's a very abstract kind of concept, but to put it in more tangible terms, going back to 1930, the US economy the GDP was $1 trillion. As we sit here today, we're 30 trillion, so 30x. Population has increased by 3 times. The rest, most of that is productivity. And that's been a big story why the US economy continues to be one of the most dynamic globally. And that's where the promise of AI really comes in to play. When you look at many different variables of how to predict what productivity is going to do, it's a very noisy series, not an easy one to really forecast. But one of the closest correlations that we can find, and that's the graph on the right, is what I just mentioned. Spending on computer and software, if we advance that by 5 years, has a pretty decent correlation with what productivity is doing. So hopefully, all that spending is going to show up with probably a lag. It's not going to happen overnight into faster growth. So maybe instead of the long-term potential growth rate of the economy being 1.8%, 2%, maybe look like something 2.5% over time. Now, how about the labor market? The productivity story definitely is a positive one if AI is done right. There's several studies, one by the St. Louis Fed, which has found a link. Of course, this is early research, and there's going to be a lot more on this topic. But there's been a link found between the jobs that have a high adoption rate of artificial intelligence and the rise in the rate of unemployment. If you look on the top right, computer and math professions, software development, all these programmers, they have a high adoption rate for artificial intelligence, and that's the group that has seen the biggest increase in unemployment. And then looking at the real world, real-time data for job openings from Indeed on the right. Basically, job openings for software developers are down 75% from the peak. If you recall, after the pandemic days, once people graduated, students graduated, they were really immediately they were hired, and there was a lot of competition for talent, which is no longer the case for this field. And then on the flip side, you can see on the bottom left, personal services, which is barbers, childcare professionals, which these are professions with low adoption of AI. We haven't seen much disruption there. Now, another study looks at what percent of the tasks one is doing on the regular job can be performed by AI. And you can see that about 55% of the jobs, AI can only do up to 50%. They cannot be easily automated. The good news is that only 1% can be 100% automated, basically fully replaced by AI without human supervision. But the more concerning story is that about 25% of the jobs that exist today, AI can do about 90 to 99% of the tasks. So something to monitor. In our view, similar to past technological breakthroughs, is going to be a period where we do see some disruption in the early stages of adoption, but if the productivity story comes through, that means higher economic activity, which tends to generate more jobs. It's not going to be the same type of jobs, a little different, but historical disruptions and technological disruptions, that's what they've shown. And there's a stat that about 40% of the jobs that exist today did not exist 60 years ago.